Have you noticed the fatigue and discouragement that seem to be growing as this year drags on? Kind of captured in a question I heard recently. Is this ever going to end? First, we began with the coronavirus that led to the COVID-19 infections with many deaths, and it seems to still be going on strong 6 months later. And even in some places, it seems to be growing. And with the pandemic came restrictions that led to losses of jobs, of income, even for some loss of housing. And curtailment of life as we've known it has come about. We've been cut off from people we love and from activities we love. Next came a rash of highly visible acts of injustice, followed by peaceful protests, some of which unfortunately morphed into violent protests and anarchy. Added to that has been the constant and now increasing political war of words and actions, sharply polarizing people and groups in an all-out battle. And in the midst of all of this, we've recently been experiencing unbelievable heat waves and historically devastating fires. So much has been going wrong, and no one seems to be in control. And that leaves us feeling helpless, like there's so little that anyone can do. So the question is, what can we do? As I've been reflecting on that question, my attention has been drawn to a wilderness experience of King David. And as I looked at it, I discovered that it has helped to offer us, by means of what he did in his wilderness experience. As we learned last week, following Christ does not mean that we will not face wilderness or painful experiences. In fact, Jesus himself all but guarantees us that at some point as we follow him, we will find ourselves in such a situation. David himself was no stranger to such experiences. In 2 Samuel chapter 15 and 16, we read of one such wilderness experience that was brought about by David's son, Absalom. Chronologically, the fourth in line to the throne, Absalom ingratiated himself to the people who came seeking justice from King David. And as chapter 15 verse 6 tells us, by doing this, he stole the hearts of the people of Israel away from David. Not satisfied with that, he masterminded a coup d'etat, a government takeover, which forced David, his family, and his loyal leaders, soldiers, and servants to flee for their lives to the desert of Judah. And in doing so, he had to leave behind the Ark of the Covenant, which was the place where God's very presence was considered to dwell. As we read about that, we're told he left weeping, his head covered, his feet bare, which were signs of deep anguish and grief. He also discovered that one of his personal counselors had gone over to help Absalom. He was let down by some who he expected to be loyal to him. And he was loudly harangued and cursed by yet another person as he was on his way to the desert. And finally, we're told in chapter 16, verse 14, that the king, that's David, and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted. David finds himself in a wilderness both physically and emotionally, wondering if he has lost everything, wondering if this will ever end, or if this will turn out to be the end of him. But that's not where David stops. In 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14, it adds one more sentence, which I did not read yet. And that is, and there he refreshed himself. They came there exhausted, and there David refreshed himself. Now, this could mean that he took refreshment there. But another thought has occurred to me, and it comes from what we find in Psalm 63, which is the text we're going to be reflecting on this morning. You see, the title of this psalm, Psalm 63, has in it a psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. He wrote it when he was in the desert of Judah. And then he refers to himself as the king who rejoices in God in this desert situation in verse 11. And that leads me to believe that what he communicates in this psalm shows us how David refreshed himself in the wilderness. And I think that's where we're going to find encouragement today, in our wilderness. I believe that what David did in his wilderness can help us out in our wilderness as well. So let's look at what David did. As we noted earlier, when we're faced with a wilderness experience, it's easy to become fatigued and discouraged. And that's because we even fixate on our situation, wishing that with everything in us that we could just get back to where we were before, when everything was better, whether it was better or not. But in doing so, we have a hard time seeing what we're going through from a right or proper perspective. That's why a lot of people who are going through tough times turn to someone else for counsel who can be objective, somebody who can see what they're going through from a more complete perspective. When you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see everything that's going on. When we fixate on a particular outcome, we often tend to get things out of order. We want to skip everything and go straight to the solution. I just want this to be done and get back to where I was. But in this psalm, David models for us a better order of steps that I believe will help us finally see things from a proper or more accurate perspective and help us find hope even in our worst wilderness. In this psalm, David basically takes two steps that ultimately lead to a place of clearer understanding and hope. First of all, David makes God his greatest desire. David took the opportunity he had while being sidelined, as it were, to seek God with everything in him, not primarily asking God to get him out of there, but to seek God, for himself. We realize right now we're kind of sidelines. We're kind of shut down. This is an opportunity for us not to seek to simply get out of this situation, but to seek God for himself. You see, when we make getting out of our wilderness or anything else for that matter our primary desire, we effectively cut ourselves off from the only one who is able to really do something about our situation. When we're focused on nothing else but getting out of this, we fail to focus on God, and he's the only one who can really do something about it. In verse 1, David cries out, "God, you are my God. Early," or a better translation is, "earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you, while my whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water." The key is found in the very first phrase. God, you are my God. As Dr. Derek Kidner, an Old Testament scholar, puts it this way, this is not the groping of a stranger feeling his way toward God. Rather, it's the eagerness of a friend, almost a lover, to be in touch with one he holds dear. You see, this is not someone crying out to God as if any God will do as long as they'll just get him out of the situation. This is someone who knows God and who has known and experienced God's power and glory and love, and now concentrates on and reminds himself of this God far above anything else that he's going through or wants. Because he's known God, because he reminds himself of God, That reminds him that God is the one he longs for more than anything else that he's going through right now, even more than getting out of it. He earnestly looks for God in the midst of this terrible wilderness, letting the things that he's longing for point him to a deeper longing for that which only God can fill. Here he lets his natural thirst in a parched desert remind him of and awaken him within him an urgent, all-consuming thirst for and longing for God and God alone. Looking back, he reminds himself of how God has met him and how he's experienced God in the past, before he ended up in this wilderness. How God seemed so real, so alive to him then. Sometimes, when everything's going great, God is alive, God is real, and we get in the desert and we go, where is he? He's dead. But David said, no, I remember how real you were, how alive you were, and how he knew and tasted of God's love. Listen to verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3. Lord, I have seen you in the sanctuary, and I beheld your power and your glory. Your love is better than life itself. I will not forget that. And those inward feelings cannot help but work their way out into outward expressions of praise to God, motivating him to worship God right there in the middle of the wilderness. That's what comes in the next verses. Listen, verse 3, the last part, and verse 4. My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands in praise. He's not ignoring his circumstances. He's simply giving himself fully, first and foremost and totally, to the one who moves him more deeply than his present circumstances. But David does not stop there. Secondly, David makes God his greatest delight. When we make God our greatest desire and think about who he really is and how real and powerful and loving he is, we can't help but delight in him. Finding in him a satisfaction that nothing else, not even getting out of this, can offer. Which again leads us to sing his praises. In verse 5, he says, after he's thought about all these things, I will be satisfied with you as with the richest of foods, the most delicious meal I can imagine. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. Oh Lord, I've got to praise you. You see, instead of lying awake, worrying through the night, he spends his waking hours thinking about God, not about his problems, and reflecting on ways in which God has been a help to him in the past. These memories in turn then fill him with confidence that in God that enables him not to simply whistle in the dark, hoping against hope that things will get better, but actually to sing for joy, assured that even as he clings to God, God is holding him securely. Listen to verse 7 and 8. Because you are my help, which I know because of all the things I just thought of, I sing in the shadow of your wings. There's that picture again that we saw last week in Psalm chapter 91, verse 4. The picture of young birds securely under the covering wings of a mother bird. He's saying, I cling to you. Your right hand, your strong, your powerful hand upholds me or holds me fast, holds me secure. Only then, in verses 9 through 11, he spent the first 8 verses talking about his desire for God and his delight in God. Only then, in this passage, in the last part, having made God his greatest desire and his greatest delight, does David finally turn and reflect on his current wilderness situation. You see, it's because only then is he able to see God and to make God his defense against everything that's coming against him. Only as he's seen God's power and glory and love and delighted in them can he see clearly and confidently that no matter what others are doing, no matter what other forces are threatening to undo him, he can count on God to defend him, to vindicate him, and to bring about genuine justice that he so longs for. And only then can he truly rejoice, even in the midst of his wilderness circumstance, confident that everyone who gives of him or herself wholeheartedly to the Lord will be able to rejoice and fully enter into God's glory, while those who gossip and slander and lie will ultimately be silenced. Listen to verses 9 and 10. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. They will go down into the depths of the earth. They'll be given over to the sword, in other words, killed, and become food for jackals. They'll be so completely destroyed that what's left of them will only be left for the lowest scavengers on the food chain. He's not just saying, well, I want to see them get nailed. He isn't just venting anger. He's saying, I can see this is going to happen. You're going to bring this all about. And then he goes on, but I, the king, will rejoice in God, and all who swear by him will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced. God, there's going to come a time when no matter what's been going on, no matter what wrong has been going on, I will come out rejoicing, and all those with me who honor you, while those who seem to be in power, those who told all those lies, they'll be silenced. In our present wilderness, being hit by one disaster after another, it's so easy to fixate on all that is going wrong, or on nothing else but getting back to normal. It's so easy as well to look for or to someone else, anyone else who assures us that they can get us out of this mess. Even in this election season, who's going to get us out of this mess? I can assure you it's not going to be any of the presidential candidates or anybody else elected in office. It's also so easy to assign blame to everybody we can for the mess we're in. Well, it's their fault, it's their fault, it's your fault. But none of these things really get us anywhere. In many respects, perhaps what David did seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't we just figure out what's going wrong, figure out where we want to go and what's the best way to get there, and just go for it? That's the way we handle it. Only right now, we haven't gotten anywhere with that. But what David is showing us is, in reality, the right order that I believe we need to follow in addressing our own present wilderness. You see, only when we desire God more than anything else, even more than getting out of it, will our priorities be straightened out. Only when that's our highest desire will everything else fall into place. And only when we give ourselves to remember and recognize all that He's already done for us will we be able to truly delight in Him above everything else and everyone else and in spite of everything else. And that'll enable us to sing to Him and to cling to Him in the midst of our wilderness when it seems that everyone and everything else is lost. In other words, only when we truly worship God in our wilderness will we be able to see everything as it really is from a proper perspective. And only then will we be able to take on whatever comes against us. We'll be able to do that confident that God Himself will defend us, will vindicate us if we're being put down or attacked, and will ultimately bring about true justice, not just man's attempts. We are not in control of much in our present wilderness, but God is. If we recognize this, and if we follow David's example, it will make all the difference in the world and likely in eternity. And that is the good news.